Today is June 18th, 2024. Welcome to Native Calgarian. Oki, Naganago, Mekoche, Chestokom Aki, or Nagana Gote de Kots Nagotine Siku Saradi. Hi, my name is Red Thunder Woman. My married English name is Michelle Robinson, and I use she, her, they, them pronouns. My Dene lineage roots me in the land of the Great Bear Lake tribe in Treaty 11. My people wore rabbit skin, so it's been referred to as the land of the Hare people. I'm a native to Turtle Island, and my Dene nation is uninvited to this area of Pincho Tine Indahe in Satu Dene, meaning many big dog town, named after the Calgary Stampede. I was born in Calgary, or in Blackfoot, Mokinstis, as Michelle Elliott, an English name that has afforded me privilege in an English colonial world. Acknowledging proximity to whiteness is important because the darker the skin, the more racism a person experiences. My mother is Northern Slavey Dene or Satu Dene, but my Indian Act imposed status card by the Canadian government says Yellowknives Dene. Through my father, I am a daughter of the Mayflower, a daughter of the American Revolution, and I have a Canadian Indian Act imposed status card. That is a colonial construct by Canadian policies meant to divide Indigenous peoples' inherent rights. Indigenous Two-Spirit or the Indigenous 2S LGBTQ community and Indigenous women are at the bottom of the Canadian socioeconomic ladder because of colonial trauma, imposed poverty, racism, gendered violence, and land theft. According to the 2023 Quality of Life Report of the Calgary Foundation, 31% of racialized Calgarians cannot find suitable employment. I am not a social worker, nor an elder, nor do I speak on behalf of all Indigenous, but I share my journey as a Dene mother navigating this colonial, misogynistic, racist world in 2024. As a trauma-informed Dene woman who attempted to run, joined harmful colonial parties, spent money to be at expensive conventions, left my home to travel to those conventions just to vote on incomplete policies that still allow for incarceration, a denial of justice, a denial of health services, racism, colonial trauma, and genocide of Indigenous and Black peoples. I have worked to continue reports to advocate and attempt to work within systems meant to harm me and my community. I think of all of this today, and I hope we honor the many Indigenous lives lost for this so-called country of Canada. I hope that you see your role in the importance of stopping harm, and as a citizen, see your role in reconciliation and as a treaty partner. Pride Month should never just be 1 month. It is important to understand that the straight agenda and gendered violence was enforced on this land by Christian outsiders. Land acknowledgements are critical for creating a safer space for Indigenous, as well as honoring the host as the guest and acknowledging your role as a treaty partner in a so called time of reconciliation. Can they be performative? Of course. It's important that all land acknowledgements have incredible meaning. I encourage everyone to introduce themselves with their acknowledgement of their ancestors, story of displacement, how you perceive your role as a treaty partner, a citizen of Canada, a refugee, or other land displacement, so we as Indigenous people know how safe you are to be around. If you don't know how to pronounce your local Indigenous nations' names, won't say your pronouns, won't say your story of origin, won't acknowledge stolen lands, won't acknowledge imposed economic oppression or your role in reconciliation, I determine how safe you are to be around my community, my family, and myself, because we face the most colonial violence based on ignorance, or worse, willful anti-Indigenous biases. Understanding land acknowledgements and their importance is Indigenous 101 because it does address colonialism, oppression dynamics, broken treaties, and lies taught today in Canadian schools nationally. That's why settlers and those who call themselves native Calgarians, or whatever town you're from, you show me you have no Indigenous 101 understanding. Jesse Winty's book Unreconciled explains this perfectly, as do many other Indigenous authored books. Land back is a movement that could save the planet from climate change created by colonialism, but it would be a part of a treaty partnership, part of meaningful reconciliation, and honoring global initiatives like the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. I'm speaking to you on the lands of the Niitsitapi, which is the Blackfoot Confederacy. The Blackfoot south of the imposed US-Canadian border in English are the Blackfeet, or the Umskak Bibi Gani. North of the border are the Siksika, Kainai, and Bagani of the Confederacy. These lands are Treaty 7, signed September 22nd, 1877, with signatures that include the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Goodstoney, formerly Wesley, the Chiniki, and Bearspaw Nations of the Iyarhi Nakota, and the Dene from Sutina. I acknowledge all First Nation, Métis, Inuit, status, and non-status across Turtle Island as the keepers of these lands. All non-Indigenous are treaty partners with the government signing on your behalf. My Patreon account is Native Calgarian, where you can pledge and support. Thank you, previous donors, for showing your support. If you value listening or watching and can afford to give, thank you. For those who cannot afford to give, I'd love to hear from you at nativeyyc@gmail.com, where you can send in your comments or questions. I have a really good one to say later today. Also, giving a review helps, whatever medium you're listening from. I have a YouTube channel that you can go and subscribe. Go to nativecalgarian.com for the latest podcasts and pin posts on social media. So today I'm super excited. I've been excited for like the last 24 hours because one of the folks that I look up to in my life is Pam Palmater, and I would like for you to introduce yourself in your way. Thank you for coming on my podcast.
Oh my gosh, you know you've made it when you're on the Native Calgarian. So let me just say I am so pumped to be here. Kwe Nindaluizi Pam Palmater. I'm from the sovereign Mi'kmaq Nation in unceded Mi'kma'ki, Eastern Territory, what people know as the Atlantic Provinces effectively. Our territory is all of Nova Scotia, all of PEI, parts of Newfoundland, parts of New Brunswick, parts of Quebec, and parts of Maine. So we're what's known as a cross-border tribe effectively, because we do have Mi'kmaq Nation in the US as well. I too am also a registered status Indian, to be precise, a 6-1 Indian, and there's a whole bunch more precision because the Indian Act is just so bizarre. I'm also a band member or a member of my First Nation, which is Ugbaganjig, Eel River Bar First Nation. And my pronouns are she and her, or mama, or grandma, Mi'kaju in our language, or sister, or auntie, or cousin. I'm literally come from the biggest, most amazing, crazy, radical family on the planet. So if you like what I do, thank them. If you don't like what I do, it's all my fault.
I love that. Yeah, that I know how that feels. I think of my family, and at the end of my podcast, I always try to thank them to remind them, like, you're the reason why I do this, and yeah, any mistakes are on me, not them. Well, thank you for coming on. I was talking to you yesterday, and I was already reminiscing about I don't know more, and we were going to talk about some current issues and your podcast as well. I'm super excited that you started one because to me, I think it's important that more Indigenous voices are being told out there, like through media representation. We don't see it much. So, and tell me the journey about becoming a podcaster and why you named it what you named it.
Wow, that's such an amazing question because I've had to really think about those things. For me, Warrior Life as the title of a podcast just fit for me because in our tradition and in many other traditions like Anishinaabe culture and others, the idea of a warrior is not what you see on TV. It's not Arnold Schwarzenegger with a big machine gun or the biggest, strongest guy beating up the next one. The warriors in our nations are really the people who are held in high esteem for their big heart and love for their people. So, what does that mean? Yeah, it means that they are always there to advocate for and protect our people no matter what, like no conditions attached. We stand up for everybody, those with a voice, those without a voice. And that often comes at a great personal sacrifice. So it means, a lot of your time is dedicated to that. You don't get to do all the fun things all the time that other people do. You risk public ridicule and harassment. There's risks to your personal freedom and autonomy from police, for example,
Yeah.
who want to stop warriors on the front lines. And so warriors come in a whole bunch of different categories. We recognize them as land defenders and water protectors, the people who are, in Idle No More, but they're also the activists who are out there, the advocates who are speaking up. They are all the trailblazers who are doing their best, say, in education to educate a whole new generation of people to leave behind those old racist ideologies. So it really, that was the word to me that fit all of the people that I look up to. And originally this was going to be, okay, I am going to get to talk to people I consider to be my heroes. And I thought, maybe this will just be like a short seasonal thing. But I still haven't gone through all the heroes. I think I'm at 160 episodes and it's
Yeah.
like hero after hero after hero. And it just goes to show how many of
Yes.
our people have love for our other people. So that's kind of where the title came from, why I decided to do podcasts. And I know that you're going to relate to this because I know we talked about it yesterday, is that I have been in the media for a long time, whether it's radio or mainstream news outlets on TV, for example. And you know what it's like in the media. If it's mainstream TV, you're lucky if you get like a 2-minute hit
Mhm.
where you're answering questions really, really quickly, not really able to give full context unless you're talking really fast. So I've learned to talk really fast, but I prefer not to do that. Then there's some things where maybe you're on a panel and it's longer. So maybe it's a 15-minute panel, but you're defending yourself and being native against other members on the panel. So it's a detraction from the real issues. There's
Yeah.
simply not enough time. Now, things have improved. I think since Idle No More, media outlets have improved. There's more native voices on there and finally native women voices, because even when media did start, it was like native men and only elected politicians. Thank goodness we've branched out and we talk to grassroots people too.
Yeah.
But even at that, even with the improvements that they made, we cannot talk about our issues
Mhm.
in a meaningful way that the public is going to understand unless we have more time. And
Yeah.
I figured, well, here's a podcast. I can make it half an hour, or 5 hours if I want to, whatever it takes to get the story out there and for people to understand the context. Because I know Canadians
Mhm.
have been really disserved with the education system, with governments who don't do any positive public education. You just They don't have all the facts, and the media has just set this horrible groundwork for how we're portrayed in the media.
Yeah.
And so that's why I decided to do the podcast. I thought, well, I will at least have control over what I'm talking about, who I'm talking to, and explaining all the context. Similar reason why I started YouTube, because I could have videos.
Yeah.
In fact, I started YouTube first and then I went to podcasting. But
Yeah.
yeah, that's why I did YouTube, because I effectively wanted to do my own media,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah, I feel that. For me, I get, yeah, the two sentence soundbite, maybe. I get that. So I remember taking media training from one of our, great warriors. His name is Harlan Pruden. He started the Two Spirit Journal, and he did free media training for us here in Calgary. And that's where I learned that when you're talking to media, like colonial media, you only get two sentences. So make sure you're always going back to those two sentences. And yeah, so I learned a lot from him from that. And as you know, our conversations are not two sentences, with no context in the Canadian media at all about why it is that we have problems. Even these land acknowledgements for me. So I did geomatics before I had my child and became an advocate for Indigenous people because, that was what we did. I was a second generation oil and gas person, my husband third. And so, we just focused on getting jobs and trying to survive this colonial world. And then I experienced systemic racism in the hospital because I'm a 6.2. So my mom is how I get my lineage, and it sounds like your dad is how you got yours. So and that just upsets me to no end that there shouldn't be a difference based on that gender. So S3 is supposed to help change that, but like my daughter has been going through this process now for over 2 years, and we still haven't got her a yes or a no. And in my nation, and I know my poor Métis brothers and sisters from Red River are going to hate this, but up where I'm from, if you're a child of Dene lineage, you become Yellowknives Métis. So we're at a place where today's her last day of high school for grade 11. And so, we got to start thinking scholarships and post-secondary. And also, what classification is she going to be? Right. And right now she's just non-status. She really is. And everyone in the city knows who I am, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that gets her scholarships, etc., right? Like we have to showcase that in this day of pretend Indianism and all sorts of, claims and people attacking institutions. They don't want to, deal with that because they're so ignorant on Indigenous issues anyway. So, there's so much to unpack, and I've already gone in three different streams, even though I've taken my ADHD meds this morning. So I didn't mean to sidetrack from our media representation, but it is all tied together because there are a lot of people who claim indigeneity, but they don't deal with the day-to-day racism that you and I have to deal with. And one of the things that I really looked up to you the most when I was first starting my political journey was you would put out these great articles, these great blogs about the reality of funding and what was going into which. And I just find it, I wanted to find all your water infrastructure pieces again from way back when, because you were the first one to give a real critique of the Liberal government, which I'm a part of, to the lack of investment into Indigenous water structure. Your blog was like, oh my God, so this was what came out in the first budget, this is what we needed. And that was just like broke my heart. I'm like, God. And now in today's moment, I have some of my Calgary water that I can drink. We have running water in Calgary right now. So the deal is that 50% of our water is coming from a different source than the other source. So if we had a major fire, there would be a problem with pressure in the hydrants. It sounds like that's really what it would be. But like, I don't have to boil my water. I can still drink it. I'm a bougie native in an urban environment, so I can drink my water and it's clear, it's not muddy or nothing. But, this morning I'm talking about this pipe coming from San Diego, but yet we still don't have clean drinking water. And that's a big conversation that's happening even here in Alberta, that we could do this really quick fix for the Calgary Stampede and for Calgary, but we certainly couldn't for Indigenous. Like, what are your thoughts on our water issues across this country?
Well, the Calgary issue. So first of all, I never would wish a lack of water, clean water, or lack of sanitation on anybody for anything. It obviously, water is life, to be very literal about it, but it's also about mental health and well-being, to be able to clean yourself, to keep your babies free from infections, healthcare. Like, I think of, oh my gosh,
Yeah.
much water is used in healthcare to prevent infections. So it's very, water is essential. Now, Canada is one of those countries that has tons of water. You wouldn't know it from the, water crisis in First Nations, but Canada has one of the biggest territories, has one of the most major water sources in terms of lakes. It's on 3 coasts. It has huge, water reservoirs, water tables, so to speak. So there should be absolutely no reason for First Nations not to have water,
Yeah.
running water and sanitation. So what Calgary's going through, is just a little tiny that fear that people have. Oh my gosh, what if I don't have water to drink tomorrow? Or what if I can't shower tomorrow? Or what if I can't clean my baby tomorrow? Like, that's a very legitimate fear. I was fearful for Calgary.
Yeah.
And that's the way many First Nations have lived, and not just for a month at a time, 6 months, 2 months, but
Yeah.
some of them have been years, like years in the making, well over a decade. And in fact, you mentioned my blog. One of the reasons why I started my blog, so that was like pre-podcast, pre-YouTube, was because of all of the misinformation in the
Yes.
media that just used to make me so angry, and all of the political speak, and all the parties do it. No party's innocent, whether you're at the federal or provincial level. And I just thought, you know what? I want people to have all the information, before you start saying 1 billion is too much for water, how much more do they want? It's like, okay, well, you actually need to know that the cost to have everyone having clean running water would be 6.5 billion. So 1 billion in light of that, yeah, you can see how that's just not going to work. And we would never put up with that in any other non-Indigenous territory.
Yep.
And I also wanted them to really to understand it in simple terms. So for example, you have Northern First Nations who like a struggle to have clean running water or access to water at all. Yet when mining companies come into their territory, like literally right beside First Nations, and dig out all of their resources, not share them either, by the way,
Yeah.
amazingly enough, they get water pumped in. They have sanitation. They have access to top-notch health care, the healthiest food imaginable. And I'm like, wait a second. All these politicians who said, oh, you live in the north, so it's too hard to bring water, or you live in the north, it's too hard to bring sanitation or anything else. Uh, I just wanted people to understand just how ridiculous that is. And the fact that many of the urban areas actually draw water away from First Nation territories so that First Nations can't access running water because it's all piped away. And now it would be illegal to go anywhere near the reservoir, so to speak, or the water table. So there's a lot that's going on with water that just violates basic human rights, but also the environment. It's historical, but it's also current. And so I think this talk about water is super important because we're still in a stage where we have a water crisis in many First Nations, not all of them.
Yeah.
But any government that says, hey, we had 200 long-term water advisories, and now we only have 80 long-term water advisories. Okay, so that's an improvement, but it's not the whole picture. Because as you know, probably if you've read my blogs, the Auditor General said, well, wait a second, short-term water advisories that are consecutive in a First Nation can add up to longer than a long-term water advisory. So by not actually reporting on all of these short-term water advisories, or the fact that you can lift a long-term water advisory and the very next day implement a short-term water advisory. So it looks like you've lifted the long-term water advisory, but now you're still in a water advisory. Or they don't report on how they've allegedly remediated the problem. So, oh, we've been able to lift this long-term water advisory. How? Did you fix the water treatment plant, or did you just truck in bottles of water? And sometimes that's what they were doing. So to me, that's not a long-term fix. That's okay, we're able to say that we're bringing you water. And, not to just rant about water, but I just feel like it's so important, especially now for Calgarians who are living in this kind of fear, is, and that doesn't include all of the people who don't have access to running water at all. So not just dirty water, but no running water or sanitation. Or they rely on cisterns, like old, decayed, polluted cisterns where water is trucked in. Or they rely on wells that weren't properly dug and they too are contaminated. So the problem with long-term or short-term, any kind of water advisory on a First Nation is it's for the First Nation. It doesn't track how many homes have water and how many homes don't.
Yeah.
So for example, you could have a First Nation that says, okay, we're lifting your long-term water advisory. Well, that's great for the 60% that have water, but for the other 40% who don't have access to running water at all, that doesn't say it. But you never get to know that unless you're digging into the facts and the background and reading reports. And how many Canadians have the time or ability to do that? So why I started my podcast, my blogs, my YouTube, because I really, really want people to know all the facts, to be able to put it in context,
Yes.
and this water is such a huge issue.
Yeah, I know. And right now it's fire season too. So, with these restrictions, like normally I do a sacred fire every full moon. And because we have a walk coming from Edmonton to Calgary to talk about missing and murdered Indigenous peoples, I was going to do a 4-day ceremonial fire here. But because we have a complete fire ban, I'm like, I don't know if we should be doing this. And my original place for Good Hope, like they're all evacuated and forced to go to Norman Wells right now. So, I'm just like, all the signs are saying, don't do the ceremonial fire. So I'm not going to. But if I go through the hoops of the city of Calgary, then I can do a ceremonial fire. And I'm just too angry at the world to even go through paperwork for something like that. I won't do it because I'm like, that's not right. That's colonial ways of doing things, not that's not native. So I'm just kind of angry about it. But to talk about why is really why I brought this up. So why is because if there's not enough pressure in the hydrants right now, like, and there's a mass fire somewhere, we're in big trouble as a city. So like if there was a big grass fire that came through and started a community, we'd be in big trouble. And so that's the emergency. That's the problem right now. It is the amount of that. But back to what we were talking about, how there's like maybe 60% of the res has some water. They don't have infrastructure for fire hydrants, and they certainly don't have money allocated for any type of firefighting. And that's a serious problem across the nation when it comes to Indigenous peoples, being forced on these little itty bitty reses with absolute underfunding when it comes to infrastructure. That I was really happy to see the National Indigenous Economic Strategy talk about, a massive injection to start with some infrastructure funding for all of the nations, because I mean, we got housing issues, we got all of the issues. There's not an issue we don't have because of the chronic underfunding, that chronic imposed poverty. But like we don't have fire and hydration systems all across these reses to fight fires, and that's another thing that non-natives don't even know about. Like we very rarely have a policing group. So I heard that in Ontario they don't have the same rights as here, but we do have like the blood tribe, and we have Sutina. They have like their own policing force, and they have the same rights as any other police under the Police Act here in Alberta. So like there's so many differences depending on what province you're in, depending what funding you're getting, depending on who's happy with what. And in Alberta, it is the energy companies that are making up for some of the funding that the other provinces don't necessarily get, because they don't have like oil and gas just drill in here, right? So like that's how we'll get like an arena or a hospital on a res, is because of fossil fuels injecting that money for the exact reason you said. Because you can't go across the river and go to a man camp and see these guys have clean drinking water, and across the river, like here's a whole community that doesn't. Nothing makes sense in this province, I swear, and this country for that matter. So yeah, the
And
fire
think about
issue.
the other side of that too,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So, Calgarians are in this water crisis, and you have, people saying, don't shave, maybe don't shower, don't flush your toilet all the time,
Yeah.
fine, because you're in this crisis, but there is no slowdown to the mass amounts of water being used by the extractive industry, whether it's fossil fuels, whether it's mining, whether it's forestry, like any of those things. So it's all well and good to give an arena, but if you are literally sucking up all of the water that really should be going to First Nations, or in places like Ontario, where we could have water, but it's all going to Nestle so that they can sell the water, so I'm always of multiple minds when it comes to things like that. And,
Yeah.
Infrastructure is something that First Nations have a legal right to. Remember when the feds and provinces divided up jurisdiction under the Constitution, the feds were like, oh yeah, we get everything Indians and lands reserved for Indians. Okay, well, you have a legal responsibility to address all of the infrastructure. So some First Nations have some fire services. Some First Nations have different policing groups. There's tribal cops in one of the Mi'kmaq communities in Quebec, for example. So it's different all across.
Yep.
Large amount of factors there, but the fact that a large number don't have that infrastructure was done on purpose.
Yes.
So that we wouldn't want to live on reserve someday, and that other people make money. So for fire services, money that should be going to us for infrastructure goes to the province or municipality to pay for them to provide the service, which isn't always good. We know from the statistics in past reports that you can call for a fire on the res and you're going to be the lowest priority, despite the fact that you get big bucks from the federal government for that. And here's the other thing about that. First Nations people are multiple times more likely to die in a house fire than Canadians are, for this very reason. And when a report came out, it was in the last decade or 15 years, about the disproportionate number of kids that die in house fires because of this lack of infrastructure, the federal government stopped tracking the number of deaths, so that, you know, we don't even have access to that information. Now, mind you, that was under the conservative government, and nothing puts past me on that thing. But there's all of these things. It's
Yeah.
not just, hey, we don't have a shiny new fire truck. It's, hey, this number of kids die every year
Yeah.
in our community. Like, it literally is life and death. And I don't know that Canadians or Calgarians really grasp the true nature of all of these things. And when they're all brought in a cumulative way, just how serious the issue is. We literally
Yes.
should have tripartite federal, provincial, and First Nation emergency management. We should
Yes.
have funding and access to all of these things.
Yes, yes, yes. This is why I wanted you on the show, so that maybe you could articulate it in a way that my listeners like. I get tired of listening to me. I'm so grateful you got to say it, because hopefully they'll hear it. There was something I wanted to ask you that another reason why I have so much immense respect for you. You know, I at the end of my podcast, I talk about how, you know, we're surveilled. And that was really apparent to me when Colton Crowshoe passed in my neighborhood, and we had a vigil in my community center park. They wouldn't let us in the community center at the time, so this was 15 years ago now, and they wouldn't even let us in there. And so the cops were surrounding us. The helicopter was over top of us while we're having a vigil, and we were surveilled the entire time. And at that moment, all I knew was that both you and, at that time, Dr. Cindy Blackstock were both being like constantly surveilled. We were all surveilled from in Idle No More, all of us. And so I wanted to ask you, like, what did that feel like at that time, being that being so surveilled, that you knew that there were all eyes across the country were watching you in the wrong way, from law enforcement, from the colonial structure. How did that feel at that time?
Well, so in addition to it being a gross violation of our privacy rights, that's not justified by any kind of prima facie a case, a legal case, or urgency, or crisis, or domestic terror, like nothing like that. Massive violation of our privacy rights, our human rights, our Indigenous rights, you name it,
Yep.
is the fact that I was raised, in addition to my parents, by my older brothers and sisters who knew all about, you know, surveillance and how cops target us, and law enforcement in general, whether it's the army, corrections officials, you know, parole officers, police of all kinds,
Yep.
anyone that's in an enforcement, you know, fisheries officers, natural resources officers.
Yeah.
They've always treated us in a very racist way. They've always surveilled us. And I think what was good about the media covering Dr. Cindy Blackstock being surveilled by, not just by law enforcement, but by Indian Affairs. Hello, that's not their mandate. They don't get money to be pseudo private investigators. And the same with me, you know, the same with me. It was like, okay, uh, Canadians are like, oh, this is terrible. This is horrible. And it's like, yeah, Canadians. And this is our everyday life.
Yep.
This is our everyday life. And if you look at the lists of people that have been surveilled, Mohawks, all Mohawks are just considered to be insurgents by the military, by the police. It's just like Mohawk. And which is, when you think about it, so horribly racist. Anyone with Idle No More, despite
Yeah.
the fact that Idle No More was loving and happy and fun and joyous and celebratory. And yes, we were
Yep.
protesting against, you know, bad legislation and all of these ills in our communities. No one brought guns to the game. That was police officers who brought guns to the table. We didn't. We
Yep.
weren't attacking or hurting people. We weren't intimidating people, you know, like those freedom truckers, for example, who were committing crimes, sexually harassing women walking by. Like, I won't even get into them, but if you compare those two things, and ours was massive, it was
Yes.
nationwide, the biggest social movement that's ever happened in Canada. It was organic, which is what I like. There was no incorporation, there was no copyright. You know, some people tried to do that, but largely that wasn't it. We did what we felt was right in our territory at the time. So for some people, it was round dances in downtown Toronto.
Yeah.
Love that. Or in the mall, like the Eaton Center. For other people, we were doing marches, rallies, teach-ins, information sessions, all of those things. None of those are dangerous. None of those pose a risk to anybody. It certainly doesn't fall under the category of domestic terrorism or threats to critical infrastructure, as they call it now.
Yeah.
So it is really gross to know that they do that and that they take steps to let you know that they're doing that. So during Idle No More, I'd have undercover cops, primarily RCMP, come up to me and say, just so you know, we're here, we're on the ground, just so you know. And I'm like, good, just so you know, we're going to continue.
Yeah.
Or, like it's that kind of really
Yeah.
bizarre thing. And during Idle No More, when I was going to different First Nations, almost always in Alberta, if I was going to an Alberta First Nation or something, the cops would call that First Nation and ask, why is Pam Palmater coming to your First Nation? What's the plan? What is she going to do? Is there a protest? As if I'm like the nerdiest lawyer. I have never been in trouble with the law. I've never had charges or arrests or anything. Like, my danger is that I'm out there like talking and advocating
Yeah.
and, organizing people, helping to empower them. So
Yeah.
that's really, really gross, especially under the Harper era. So
Yes.
Harper effectively inspired the Idle No More movement.
Yeah.
Here's my concern that I don't know that a whole lot of Canadians know. So then Harper wants to have Bill C-51, which is the so-called anti-terrorism legislation, which was actually going to make amendments to a whole bunch of laws to retroactively make legal things that they were doing that I would argue weren't legal at the time. And many other civil rights lawyers have argued as not legal at the time, and just vastly expand what can be considered domestic terrorism. I mean, there's this like huge, huge list, and now they'll be empowered to share information back and forth, like information with Health Canada that has nothing to do with what it is that we're talking about. So this massive expanse of powers under the guise of domestic terrorism has allowed them to expand their surveillance such that if you're sitting in a circle in a First Nation, holding a candle and drumming and singing as a vigil for murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls, you're probably going to be on the hotspot list, the RCMP, terrorist watch list. And who knows what else for CSIS or other like provincial municipal cops and things like that, and or monitored and tracked and surveilled by government departments. That's really gross, especially since if you look at in Canada and the US, where have the most amount of deaths come from? White supremacist groups or individuals who subscribe to white supremacy, whether it's white nationalism, KKK, neo-Nazis, like there's a whole list of them. I don't even need to list them all, but that's who's, shooting up schools. That's who's randomly driving vehicles into racialized people. That's where the threats are coming. That's who tried to rush parliament. That, look at all of the groups that were involved in the Freedom Convoy. That's not to say all of them were a part of that, but boy, oh boy, they were all dancing in unison.
Yeah.
Very, very scary. So if they're not doing their job on this threat to national security and public safety, which both Canada and the US have acknowledged that it's these white supremacist organizations that pose the greatest domestic threats.
Yeah.
And we just focus all of our resources on Indigenous peoples, we're going to miss the moment to save people. And that's what worries me. And I
Same.
don't know that that's been properly explained
Yeah.
to Canadians.
Oh, I'm so grateful to hear you say that. I will say when Harper gave the Indian Act list to the RCMP and CSIS and all of that, and at that time, that was what gave me the biggest pause about ever giving my daughter status. Was that all you need is one crappy dictator like that jerk, and now his little protege is looks like about to win the next federal election, and you just get one person like that. And Kenny started Bill 1, which was this infrastructure act here in Alberta, which basically he never instituted for any of the convoy folks, right? But it was basically designed for us as First Nations. So all it takes are these horrible conservatives to ruin my daughter's life for just existing under the Indian Act. And I was
Well,
like,
here's the thing.
yeah, go ahead.
Make sure that she gets her status anyway, because it's about
Yes.
belonging to your First Nation. Like, to me,
Yes.
that's what it's about. It's that making sure our First Nations don't go legislatively extinct in the
Yes.
future. But under the Indian Act, an Indian is defined as someone who is registered or entitled. So whether or not she goes and gets her status, she's entitled to status because you're a 6'1", and presumably if she's your daughter, then
Yeah.
6'1", even if your husband's a non, she gets a minimum 6'2". But who
Yeah.
knows with, the other thing. So they're going to know anyway. They have all of that. Surveillance is not just, the list of status Indians. It's like, okay, all your family, all the people you hang out with, all the people you advocate with, all of your private contacts, what you're saying in your texts. It's all
Yeah.
of those things. So she will never get away from that if,
No.
you get another Jason Kenney who says, okay, yeah, you know what, we're instituting this. And just by the way,
Yeah.
Calgary, I have a bit of a beef with that former premier because unbeknownst to me, and I don't do advocacy in Alberta because there's a lot of really good advocates there. And I tend to go where people ask me. Jason Kenney has a press conference and blames the economic woes and the reason why some mining company wouldn't invest in Alberta, never mind that it wasn't economically feasible, according to the economists. I mean, I'm no economist, but to blame me and David Suzuki for Alberta's economic woes. And I was like, wait, what? What? You're having a press conference about me and David Suzuki? What are you talking about? Calling us like zealots
I
and
know.
militants and
Yeah.
that we don't care about First Nations. And I'm like, Jason Kenney, who are you?
Yeah.
I've never had any interaction. I didn't even know about this mine until it didn't go through. So what are you talking about? And then all of my friends in Alberta who are activists were like, hey, why are you getting all the credit? We've been the one protesting. And I'm like, I don't know. But it's that kind of ridiculousness,
I
and that
know. there's
there's surveillance by law enforcement and governments. But then there's also when you vilify someone in the public, it tends to people come out from under their rocks, the nasty people,
Yep.
and that's not majority of Canadians who are like, you know what? Maybe we should harass her. Maybe we should stalk her. Maybe she's a traitor to this country. And what
Yeah.
they do by that is actually cause a risk to our safety. So it's more than just, hey, you're violating my privacy. You're actually making it unsafe for Native people in this country. And that's why you see Colton Boushie. That's why you see, all
Yeah.
these cops all in every police force across the country, sexually violating and or killing unarmed Native people, you name it.
Yes. I
They've
know.
created a very hostile place for us.
Horrible. And I did so many vigils in our area because of it. I can tell you, I could name you so many Indigenous people from Robin Fiddler to the Crazy Wolf family that it is just standard practice to murder us here right in the city. And it breaks my heart because they get away with it. And ACERT is supposed to be this oversight body. But folks like me, when we apply, we can't get in there, but all of the ex-cops can, and then magically they never find anything wrong, and certainly never anything racist in any of these findings. And then even when they do, they're like, Alberta government run by extreme conservatives like Jason Kenney are like, we're not gonna proceed with this, it's fine.
Yeah.
So like that's like it's pretty bad out here when it comes to safety. And so safety is a real issue for me, and anxiety
Mhm.
now, obviously, as a result. But I wanted to give a shout out for there's one other awesome blog I wanted to give some time to, because as far as I know, you're literally the only person who's published about it. And it was, these rich chiefs that get all of the money and it never goes anywhere. And you did this blog that said, actually, most chiefs are not taking a wage. Most chiefs are taking the money and allocating it over here. And there was actually way less corruption when you analyzed it. What made you go through that process? How did that like? I just think it's one of the best things I can tell people, like, because they keep calling us corrupt chiefs and that and corrupt reses. And I'm like, actually, Pam Palmater did the work. No, it's not the case. It's the opposite.
That's so frustrating. So I did that. I did the research. So I'm not the one who actually did the research reports on what the actual salaries were or anything like that, but I did the research to see what's out there, what information is out there, because that was the old trope. right?
Yeah.
The poverty in our First Nations have nothing to do with government or dispossession of lands and resources. It's all corrupt chiefs. All these millionaire chiefs, corrupt chiefs, over and over and over again. And I'm not so naive enough to think that there aren't people who've done some bad things, or there aren't people who've favored their family in decisions. I mean, that happens everywhere in politics. It's not
Yeah.
an excuse, but when I did the research, it's like, okay, they did the Assembly of First Nations back when they were doing like research and stuff. They did the salaries for the First Nation, like chiefs and councils, because that's like who the leadership is in First Nations. Chiefs don't have any independent authority, as you likely know. And they found that all of these salaries that are paid by the federal government, that is, were on average less than what the average Canadian was making,
Yeah.
and far less than what people like municipal librarians were making. All of
Mm-hmm.
a sudden, people thought I was picking on municipal librarians. It's like, no, trust me, I'm a nerd. I love libraries. I love what you do, and you engage with the community. However, chiefs and councils have to deal with life and death, federal issues, provincial issues, municipal issues, Canadian society issues, business issues, extractive industry. Like, there is simply no comparison
No.
for what a chief and council have to deal with.
Yeah.
And they've inherited chronic gross underfunding, breach of our lands and resources, like everything you can imagine. Imagine trying to deal with that. So, to make less than the average Canadian, so that dispelled that myth, to make less in many cases than municipal librarians. And then also that there was a number, like a large number, it wasn't the majority, but there was a large number of them who didn't take a salary.
Yep.
Right? Because of they had the ability. So they had their own business, or they had some way to provide for themselves so that the money could go back into the community. No one ever wrote about that story. No one ever said, hey, let's interview some of these guys, or the other ways in which some of the chiefs sacrifice. So
Yeah.
some of them were like, okay, you know what? It's a rule on this res that you have to live on reserve to be able to run for chief. Not anymore. But back in the day, you had to reside on reserve. I'm not going to get a house. I'm going to make sure that house goes to somebody else. I'm not going to apply for a house. So we never hear those really good stories. And then the
Mm-hmm.
corruption rates, so there is corruption in federal governments, provincial, municipal governments. We know that, right? That's
Mm-hmm.
no secret. They tend to be higher in some parties than others, but our so-called corruption rates, and I'm talking not just
Yeah.
oh, that guy's corrupt. Not someone's sitting in a Tim Hortons calling people corrupt. I mean, actual legal corruption, because there's legal definitions for that, and there's criminal charges for corruption. Our corruption rate was far lower than any federal and provincial governments. And I was like, you know what? That's enough for me.
Yeah.
I'm not an economist, but that answers that question.
Mm-hmm.
So the media then tried to really find, okay, we need an example. We need an example. Like, there has got to be a millionaire chief, right? That we can just, like, it's going to be our proof. Well, they found a millionaire chief. And his salary from, the feds transfer money to First Nations, and then they, can distribute it to like salary and staff and, services, was minimal. He made the majority of his money in economic development because he had his own businesses, and he used to be one of those like grant writers and things like that, where you got a portion of all these. And so, yeah, he was a very wealthy chief.
Yeah.
Not from the federal government.
Mm-hmm.
And so when they posted that story, to me, it was irresponsible. It's
Yep.
like, okay, you are trying to include everything and not just, this corruption for federal funds.
Yeah.
So anyway, that was my big pet peeve. And I still get that question sometimes. And I actually like getting that question, because then I can say, oh, well, here's the facts, right?
Yes.
Here's the facts. Thank you
Yep.
for asking that question. Even if they
Yes.
ask it in a nasty way, it's like, we're going to use this as a learning opportunity. Thanks for raising it. It's my favorite question, in fact.
I am so grateful. I am always grateful for whatever you put out there so that I can amplify it. And like especially out here are they think they're progressive social justice warriors, but they're really just white racist people with education degrees. And they won't listen to someone like me because I don't have a DR in front of it, but you do. So that's the great thing about taking some of your blogs and such and giving it to them and be like, if I must be some dumb Indian that I could read that and give them this wonderful piece that does come from a DR that you need. So, I obviously know that's not true. It's
Yeah,
just that
yeah.
growing up here in Alberta, I grew up in Calgary, in Fort McMurray, in Sylvan Lake, and spent most of my life in Calgary. Like the attitude people give you, like they just pat you like you're a pet, like the way I talk to my dog. Literally, that's how I get treated by social justice warriors. But I'll tell you, not David Suzuki. He was very kind.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
he came here during Idle No More, and he was very kind. And my favorite moment of Idle No More was when Ezra Levant came and he tried to say, I find the term settler very offensive. And I said, well, you should probably go down the street over to the settler society that we have here that's very proud of their pioneer roots. And every stampede we have like 4 floats of like proud settlers that talk about how hard it was to work these farms. So I think you better talk to the Calgary Stampede too after you go to the settler society down the road. And that was the last time I ever seen him. And he tried to discredit me on his show by saying, well, I seen this beautiful Native woman with green eyes because I have green eyes. So I must not be fully Native. So that was my favorite
It's
moment.
ridiculous.
Yeah.
And you know what? Rest in peace, Sun Media,
Yeah.
because that station doesn't exist anymore as it was then.
Yeah.
But I got that all the time, especially during Idle No More. And one of my favorite videos, I've liked it. I put it in a playlist on my YouTube channel to check it out, but is when that same station that has Ezra Levant, who used to bitch about me all the time,
Yeah.
they did a special show. They had this ongoing show hosted by then host Michael Corrin, and it was called 5 to Fear, like the top 5 to fear people in Canada.
Wow.
So here up comes this show, and it's called, get this, Fear Pam Palmater. And I was like, what? So it's so funny. It looks like a joke.
Yeah.
Like it seems like a joke.
Yeah.
And like my kids are older, they're in their 30s, right? So
Yeah.
when that was happening, they were, an adult. And so this comes on, it's a whole half-hour show about Pam being one of the 5 to fear in Canada. Hello, you could have said lawyer, you could have said nerd, you could have
Yeah.
said no arrest, that Pam's never made any threats, that Pam wants all Canadians and First Nation. No, it was not like that. It was literally horror music. It's like, a Pam is one of the 5 to fear. And then like, it's got all this crazy, it sounds like Stephen King music and like just going on and on about how it's a radical and left wing and all this other stuff. And I was like, are you serious? Are you
Yeah.
serious?
Yeah,
So
no. I like
that's what they
making
did.
fun of that stuff, like Indigenous creatures and all that stuff. And it's
Yeah.
just so wild. And I'm a self-identified nerd too. So I love that about you.
Yeah.
I will never understand how people can treat mothers that way too. I think that's what really offends me. We have 2 Black mothers here that are being targeted by the justice system. When I watched you and Cindy being treated that way, like it just gets so angry. Like, how can you treat mothers that way? I'll never understand that.
And you can understand, like, okay, so for me, my kids, at first I was like, oh my gosh, I can't believe they're doing this. What are people going to think about me? And my kids are like, Mom, you have street cred. This is the best video ever. Because no one gives a hoot about these far right people, but it's going to be cool. You can play it and whatever. And I was like, oh, okay, whatever. There's the lighter side to that where you can just laugh it off. The darker side
Yeah.
is when they did other videos, and like Ezra Levant commentary and others saying that I am disloyal to Canada. I'm a threat to Canada. And then you post a Google map of my neighborhood. As a single mom, that was over the edge for me. And as soon as that came out, like I didn't have to do anything. There was all these women lawyers and everything who wrote complaints about
Good.
that.
Good.
Like you're basically inviting people
Yeah.
to come and at a minimum harass me
Yep.
and who knows what else,
Yep.
especially like true hard fans of super far right conspiracy theories and everything else.
You know,
That's the scary side of things.
yep. I'm going to say this that I, with the deepest respect to our Canadian settler politicians who identify as either to us LGBTQ or women and are leaving politics. The difference between them and us is that we don't get to leave politics. Just by existing in Canada, we are political, and it's not something we get a choice to. And I will never be an elected official, but that doesn't mean I'm not going to stop being political because I can't. There's always an injustice. And, kind of you were talking about earlier, having this podcast and always having interviews with amazing people. There's something going down today in Calgary. I could probably do a whole podcast. I wish I could do a daily one because it's that bad here, you know. So, but I do have the deepest respect. But I mean, you were facing that harassment, and a lot of the Indigenous people that I know that are activists will have, and we all watch it, and it's a BIPOC, QT BIPOC. The cops are monitoring our neighborhoods a lot more. Sometimes I feel like there's a helipad on top of my roof because for whatever reason, the Calgary police have to monitor my house for an extended period of time.
My goodness. It's
Yeah.
so
So,
silly. It's so bad.
yeah.
You just sometimes you have to laugh about it while
Yeah.
also taking steps to protect other people from it. Like, is that bad?
Yeah.
I can laugh about it because I'm not sitting in prison.
Yeah.
I think of all of our brothers and sisters that are in prison because of these cops who found a way
Uh-huh.
to
Ruin their life.
falsely arrest them. And then when they're like, what? I didn't do anything, then it's resisting arrest, and then, so on and so forth. So
Yeah.
the whole thing is a bit ridiculous. Again, why our blogs, right, are important, because then it doesn't rely on outlets like Chatelaine and Maclean's and CBC. And I've written for all of them and
Yeah.
still write for all of them.
Yeah.
But it doesn't rely on them to accept your article, right? Because you write it, you give it to them, and they're like, yeah or no. A blog, you can say what's on the blog. And my motto has always been, whether it's public speaking, podcasts, blogs, whatever, is I want to have a citation for everything I say.
Mm.
I'm not just one of those people that say, oh, you know what? I think half of all people do X, Y, and Z,
Yeah.
because I will get called on that.
Yeah.
And so I need to have a fact or a stat that has a citation that I can refer to if someone says, oh, that's not true. It's like, yeah, it is true. And even like the Warrior Life podcast, I know the Native people that come on my Warrior Life podcast, they're speaking truth. They're speaking their experiences. They're rallying for causes. Like, that's the other thing about my Warrior Life podcast is they always have a call to action, which is why another reason why I'm bringing them on. So if it's land defenders who are currently being oppressed by RCMP SWAT teams,
Yeah.
well, they're like, urgent. We need people to come as observers. We also need donations for legal fees. And so we can make that call to action. We can put the GoFundMe link on there. And then people who would never have been connected to them can say, well, I can't go there because of my job. Some of us are in very sensitive jobs, but I can give a donation. There's
Yeah.
always ways that Canadians can help. And what really makes me happy is that Canadians have stepped up. The majority of Canadians, there's always
Yeah.
going to be that awful, awful, hateful bunch.
Yeah.
But the majority of Canadians are like, yeah, we support that. Yep.
Yeah.
Tell us what to do. And that's the thing. They always want to know what to do. So I try to make sure, sometimes I might forget, but I try to make sure that there is a call to action or a link or something you can read or something you can do so you feel like you're part of the solution.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. Oh, I'm so grateful to have you on. Is there anything else you'd like to add today?
No, okay. I do have a request and I get to make it in front of everyone. You know how when your kids come to you and say, in front of their friends, in front of you, say, "Hey, mom, can my friend sleep over?" And you're like, "You're not supposed to ask me in front of people." Well, I'm asking in front of you if you would do me the huge honor of coming on my Warrior Life podcast, because I don't just love your podcast. It's not just because you're famous, but because you're such a good-hearted person. You care about your culture, about learning your language, about passing that on to your family, about contributing to the community, like the way you host book clubs and the way you have your podcast and the way you go to events and the way you have like sacred fires, like all of that. That's huge. And I really appreciate you. So I would like to add to your burden and have you come on my
I'd
podcast.
be honored to be on your podcast. So
Oh,
thank you for coming on mine and inviting me onto yours and saying all those kind things. I think of my aunt. She's a lawyer. She's going to be recognized, and she was one of the first lawyers, and she was the one who worked so hard for me to even get my status. So
oh,
I have to say it's because of the strong people in
yeah.
my life. So I'm grateful to be here with you and have you talk about all of these things that I've been dying to ask you one on one. So thank you so much for reaching out, because again, it was you that reached out to me because I was too shy to even do it. So I just say thank you from the bottom of my heart for all your time today. And I'm going to do my exit, and you're welcome to stay on and listen, but and chime in if you want to as well. And if you are tapped out for time, I understand if you have to get going too. So thank you, Pam, for all of
It's
what you
all
do for
good.
our people.
Solidarity.
Right on. Oh, I'm so happy to have Pam on here today. I have a little announcement that is quite sad. Our previous guest, Howard, Casper Howard, has passed. So I want to give a shout out to his friends and his family who have, let me know in the kindest way possible. Please go listen to that episode and see what it is that he was passionate about. And if you've been following me at all, you'll see that I've been talking about the constant Narcan issues that the Indian Affairs and Alberta pharmacies have conspired with. So please have a look at that as well on my social media. I talked about it in the last episode as well. And I also wanted to give a shout out to V. Duncan. For folks who don't know, he passed away in September. And yesterday I went to the Stop Hate Alberta seminar they had while the Indigenous ceremonies were going on, and he was showcased in their video to talk about how hard it is to actually report hate with the current system that we have in Alberta, and of course had since passed. So I just found it really interesting, as somebody who knew he had passed, hearing his words of talking how hard it was and how it doesn't make you want to report. And here he passed. And so I just wanted to let people know, if you go to a Stop Hate Alberta uh, event coming up, you may see this documentary, and to be prepared for that. Our Indigenous book club was fantastic. Last time we had Alicia Two Bears talking about Two Spirit. We have a few Two Spirit events coming up. I certainly hope that people learn more about the 2S LGBTQ community during Indigenous Awareness Month. Our Reconciliation Action Group has done some amazing work over the last week, from a grad who was going to be denied wearing their beaded cap to we had them and Justice for Palestinians. We all banded together and they said, oh, okay, this kid can wear their beaded cap. And that's what we're supposed to be doing, folks. No Indigenous child in North America should ever be denied their right to culture. That's like a total treaty broken issue right there. So I just want to thank the public. I want to thank all the teachers who I know tried to work within the system, all the Indigenous folks within the system who did that work, as well as the Reconciliation Action Group and Justice for Palestinians, for all coming together for this one youth. Every Indigenous child should have that much love and support from across the country. So I wish that for everyone, and happy graduation to all of you who are graduating this year. I can't wait for my daughter to do it next year. I'm proud that this podcast has given solutions and included cultural safety training and cultural first aid in all of them to create a safer space for Indigenous, people of color, those with disabilities, and to us LGBTQ to speak. According to the 2023 Quality of Life Report from the Calgary Foundation, 88% of racialized Calgarians feel uncomfortable, out of place because of their religion, ethnicity, skin color, culture, language, gender, accent, or sexual orientation, up from 75% in 2023. I'm sure next year's got to be 100% because, like, we are seeing what's happening with our Palestinian brothers and sisters. 84% of racialized Calgarians believe racism exists, and only 66% of non racialized Calgarians. I'd love to see those numbers up on both sides. To our authors, Cheryl Ward, Chelsea Branch, and Alicia Fritkin of heretohelp.bc.ca, what is Indigenous cultural safety and why I should care about it? You know, these are cultural action tools for settlers to make Indigenous feel more included. So please support work like that as part of your reconciliation work and settler understanding. I'm just lucky enough to highlight and repeat it here. Internalized racism, lateral violence is another form of violence Indigenous and equity deserving groups experience under the structure of oppression imposed on these lands. Go to racialequitytools.org. She has tons of resource files, and she has a whole part on what is internalized racism by Donna Bevins, and give her some money if you can. Do's and don'ts for bystander intervention by American Friends Service Committee. So this is what you do when you see a Muslim woman being harassed on the C train, or you see an Indigenous person being harassed for wearing their ribbon skirt. You need to step up for me, folks. I also got to see at the Stop Hate for Alberta, the Act to End Racism folks. They were talking about getting more funding. I wanted to say this. One thing I learned that was positive, I have a lot of negative things to say, but the positive thing was they went from 5 staff, and in 2018 that got bumped up to 35 staff. They could finally afford it, and they're a national organization working on trying to end racism. They were started because of the Japanese intern camp apology, and so Canadian race relations, this was the organization that got a huge boost in funding. And so one of the co-founders was there talking about it, and now is a part of act to end racism.ca, Teresa Wupa. I'm sure lots of you know her. She was the first Asian woman ever elected in Alberta as a conservative MLA, and she's done amazing work as a those of us old enough to remember the school trustee fiasco that happened with Danielle Smith and and her and Jennifer, my favorite liberal, I can't remember her name offhand. They just had this like explosion, and Ralph Klein had to like take apart this whole school board because you had these conservatives and these liberals fighting the entire time. It was pretty funny, but not funny, obviously, at the time for them or for our children, regardless. End to act racism.ca, Teresa Wupa. A great example that as soon as we lose that funding and we go back to 5, person staff, everybody's going to be like, we should be doing more to end racism. Well, you got to invest in it, folks. So hold all of your MPs to account so that they keep their funding in the next election. I wish that anyone who follows me on social media would also watch the anti-racism organizational lead for the city of Calgary presentation on the journey of becoming an anti-racism leader. That's a YouTube channel that's open to anybody so that you can learn about being more anti-racism. And we have solidarity with the Reconciliation Action Group. We have solidarity with the Humboldt truck driver who is being deported. So we put out a great piece on that, because once you start to do anti-racism work, of course you have lots of Indigenous education to do, but the anti-racism work is important so that you can stand up when you see oppression against other people of color, which is why you see us stand up for Palestinians too. Our Calgary Black Lives Matter activists Taylor McNally and Adora Nolfort have been legally targeted. So please go to Stop the Stack YYC to find out more about how police purposely stack charges against people of color in order to keep them in jail. And again, these are 2 single mothers who the last thing they need are these types of problems. Indigenous people have been focused on our issues, talking about our traumas and reports, commissions, and public hearings, just so it can be regularly disregarded. No more. Honor our words, honor the treaties, Listen to politicians and their policies and platforms. If they don't recognize the marginalized in the budget with Gender Equity Plus, if they are cutting violence prevention programs, Indigenous education, uterus health choices, gay straight alliances, lack of human rights for migrants, immigrants, folks with disabilities, know that your vote is directly negatively impacting equity deserving people. Demand that they implement the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action, which has lots of anti-racism training. The recommendations of the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, which was in 1996. The multiple reports about child welfare reform and violence prevention. And now we have the 231 calls to justice from the National Inquiry on Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, Girls, and Two-Spirit. Provincially in Alberta, the Kenney government created 113 pathways to justice. We now have this new Premier's Council on Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. I don't know if they've ever met one single time. Municipally, we have the White Goose Flying Report. Denying these reports is a form of abuse called gaslighting. Our people are experiencing extreme racism in every institution, from health, justice, education, with multiple reports that say the same thing. Demand change from election platforms and politicians. If they don't understand colonialism, racism, privilege, sexism, they have zero business running. Should be understood by all parties, local sports clubs, politicians, community organizations. Google articles on how non-Indigenous Canadians can become allies, because there's so many of them. Also, the Calgary Foundation has a great ally toolkit that you can find at calgaryfoundation.org. I really encourage people to step up and share missing people that are Indigenous just as you would non-Indigenous. You can go to aboriginalalert.ca and have an email sign up, or you can also download the app for Missing Children Society of Canada. They are both are sending out information based off of who is missing, whether or not the police will make a report, or whether or not the family is comfortable making the report to police. Um, I just wanted to highlight again, our drug crisis that we're having nationally has killed over 2,000 people here in Alberta in just last year alone. And I'm trying to give out Narcan to as many folks as I possibly can. I encourage other Indigenous to do the same, and you get to go through the same barriers I do in order to try to access it. Bigger picture is that there are organizations on the ground doing that great work. Street Cats, YYC is one. Taylor McNally has Walls Down Collective that's doing that great work. So please donate. If someone you know is using substances, encourage them not to use alone. If you are using alone, you can download the National Overdose Response Service 188 688 NORS, or you can download the Braves, Doors, or Lifeguard apps and make a plan so that you get to stay here after. I strongly support Freedom's Path Recovery Society.ca here in Calgary. You can donate. They provide free one-on-one addiction service counseling. They have group treatment and recovery for Calgary. They're queer friendly and anti-racist. And you all know that I fully support Canada's first 2S LGBTQ addiction recovery center right here in Calgary, stonewallrecovery.ca. I was lucky enough to watch one of the Stonewall gay members just endorse straight to Stonewall Recovery, the name. So I just, it's important to say on June, where it's not just Indigenous Awareness Month, but also Pride Month. So if you're experiencing emotional distress after anything I talked about today, call the First Nation and Inuit Hope for Wellness helpline at 855-242-3310. It's toll free, open 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. And you can also go on their website, hopeforwellness.ca, and they have a little text box. And if more related to missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit, you can call 844-413-6649. Here in Alberta, we have the 60 Scoop Society of Alberta, ssisa.ca. The Indian Residential School Survivor and Family Hotline is 877-925-4419. Kids Help Phone 1-800-668-6868, and you can text at 686868. They also have a live chat for all of our youth from 7 to midnight Eastern time. The Native Youth Crisis Line is 877-209-1266. The youth line for LGBTQ is no longer existing, but you can text at 647-694-4275 or go to youthline.ca. There they have tons of resources for you. For non-Indigenous, there are distress center lines in your area, usually a functioning 211, or you can go to 988 or text 988 or go to 988.ca. Toronto has an Indigenous-led crisis support pilot that's led by the Two Spirited People of First Nations in partnership with two other organizations. So they just call 211, and you can find out more at the number 2 spirits.org. And my understanding, they just did a call out. They're going to be leading Pride Parade on June 30th. So we're trying to figure out if we can just get some emergency tickets to go down there and let my child be a part of that in some capacity, but maybe we'll have to do it next year. So happy Pride to Toronto. I'm really happy for you all. I have a friend there who's done some great work in conversion therapy, and I've been thinking about him as he's going through, some changes in his mental health, and I just miss him so much. So thinking of you, Toronto. Have a great Pride. American folks that are listening, Two Spirit Identity, with Two Spirit Identity, sorry, strongheartshelpline.org. And that's 1-844-7-NATIVE or 1-844-762-8466. Here in Canada, it gets better. Canada.org has tons of resources for the QT BIPOC. I will say I've seen some of the orgs listed in Alberta, and I can tell you they're not practicing anti-racism or have Indigenous education. So give it a try, but also remember that the MMIW line that I already gave is available. Violence is my everyday reality. Every Indigenous generation has faced it. This is self-care, how I take my power back. That's why I started the podcast, to speak freely without interruption, tone police, leadership shaming, gaslighting questions, as many people don't want to hear our opinion, sure like to tell us theirs, even if they know nothing about us. Colonialism, the constant surveillance of our people, protest vigils and rights. I and many others share info on microaggressions daily, so it's just unacceptable anymore. Learn about being trauma informed. Folks like me are dealing with internalized racism, gatekeeping, and folks who live off the status quo, folks who are really in their trauma still. So they deplete a lot of personal resources. Internal and external racism is an everyday reality for me, Indigenous peoples nationally, folks with disabilities, QT, BIPOC, and more. I want to end always by saying Masicho to my ancestors, to my granny up in heaven, to my mom of what strength looks like through your example, to my dad for teaching me to be strong and blunt. That's where my settler side comes out. My stepmom for showing me what a proud culture is through her Austrian family and roots, and teaching me to be a proud Calgarian and give me insight on anti-immigrant bias that she has experienced and her entire family experienced. I want to say thank you to my husband, Darcy, for producing and editing this show. He's been my husband, my childhood friend, father of our child, and support down my journey of the Red Road, witnessing decades of racism and sexism. And to our child, we are blessed to learn from you daily. We are honored you chose us. You give me daily accountability to be a better and stronger person. I hope my family will be proud in the future of us trying to discuss these present day issues. I honor the Blackfoot and the elders as they've been so kind to me on my Red Road journey. Elder Red Crane taught me how to pronounce my spirit name in Blackfoot, and Leonard Kenny taught me how to pronounce it in Satu Dene. My humblest apologies to the Blackfoot and Dene elders and language keepers as I try to learn proper pronunciation, and know that I'm thinking about you all, and I'm worried about my great-grandfather's cabin burning to the ground right now as you've all been evacuated to Norman Wells. My Patreon account is Native Calgarian, where you can pledge and support. Thank you, previous donors, for showing your support. If you value listening or watching and can afford to give, thank you. For those who cannot afford to give, I'd love to hear from you at nativeyyc.com. And I did have one email that I wanted to read because the reason why it was sent in was for educational purposes. And for me, I thought it was important to talk about the importance of our last episode from Tech Care and having our two friends, Dorian and Zachary, on, because I had a friend who said it was okay for me to read this, and they are a settler from Treaty 6 territory. And they said that your recent tech care hit home with me. My mother passed on May 15th, and we had a funeral on May 20th. One of my sisters is in full care and was unable to attend in person, so my wife stayed with her to watch the streamed service. I was on the point to make sure it was working properly and they were able to get it. The funeral home was streaming it on Facebook using a cell phone, which is a terrible way to do this. The audio was horrible and the picture limited, but that's all they had. About half an hour before the service, I got a message on Facebook regarding a stream of the funeral. I clicked on the link and it asked for a credit card number to access the stream account. Normally, I am tech savvy and wouldn't have touched it, but my defenses were down with the circumstances and I wanted it to be true. It became obvious with the click through that I just went through a card farming scam. I immediately canceled my card and only lost a single transaction, which Capital One reimbursed because of my prompt action. It appears they had looked through my mother's Facebook account and sent the link to everyone on her Facebook list. We watched as more and more people accepted the scam from the friend request and started sending them all warnings. There were close to 40 people that accepted it by the end of the funeral, and I know at least 2 of them admitted sending their credit card information. I assume they do this every weekend, possibly to many funerals, sending the link an hour before the funeral to catch as many people with their guard down as possible. With our elderly passing on and many of their friends also being older and vulnerable and grieving, it is absolutely ghoulish. These scammers have become modern day equivalent of vampires. The immediate protection against the scam is for funeral homes to do in-house streaming via Zoom or other service with obvious and simple links, and of course, education. Please pass that along to you, to everybody for education. So I want to say thank you for sending that, and our deepest condolences, not only for the loss of your mother, but this is a friend who's also violently lost their son as well. And so their email really meant a lot because I actually didn't know that that was a scam that people do, and it's so infuriating for people to be so ghoulish. So I hope that matters to you all too. So thank you for sending that email. We also have a YouTube channel. Of course, you can go and subscribe. Go to nativecalgarian.com for the latest podcasts and pin posts on social media. And I like to do a touch grass moment. I talk about a lot of dark things. And we see on media and social media a lot of dark things. So of course, if you follow me, you see that I send or that I reshare all the silly dog TikToks, of course, and all the fun stuff. But I just think it's really important to acknowledge for us right here, right now in Calgary, San Diego Water System Department sending us this pipeline. Really excited to see those social media tweets. I know it's left San Diego and is coming on up and it's going to be here tomorrow. So you might see me on 16th Avenue with a flag saying, "Thank you, San Diego." That's my touch grass moment. I do hope that there is a last moment, you know, change that we can get all of our infrastructure in place. As Pam said, we don't wish anyone to have, a lack of water at any point in time. So I just wanted to put that out there. So thanks, folks, for listening. And as always, we end with side eye to those Calgary rabbits. You're lucky I'm not tradish. My beautiful cousin responded, "Are you be in my dish?" Thanks, folks, for listening.